Welcome to Conversations with Barbara. I'm Barbara Kanellopoulos, and today is National Voter Registration Day. And I'm here with Larry Moore to talk about the importance of voting. And Larry is a Falmouth resident, and tell us then how you got involved in the machinery of voting.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Barbara. I've been looking forward to this. It was 2007, and I was on a Saturday afternoon. I happened to watch a documentary called Hacking Democracy. And in that video, which was very sensationalist and it caused a lot of stir in the election community, it rang a bell, it rang a chord that still rings today in me. And it got me thinking, and later on that year, I volunteered to join the Obama campaign. And after a year doing that, and being out in Columbus, Ohio, when Election Day happened and we won, on the drive back, I thought, okay, now what is my plan A? And I thought, well, maybe I could use the skills that I had developed in high tech, mostly in general management, and running big, complex, high security products, that I would try my hand and see if there was an opportunity to take those skills and apply them to elections. And so I'm a serial entrepreneur, and so I began researching and talking to people in the election community. And even then I wasn't sure that I would actually want to start a company. But the more I talked to people, the more need that I found among people who had been bypassed by technology. Here was an industry of 3,000 organizations, election departments around the country that were bereft of technology. You knew that when you went to visit them, and they would be swimming in stacks of ballots and not knowing exactly how many ballots were in each pile, and had to recount them all the time. So little by little, I became more convinced that there was an opportunity here. And along the way, I met the Secretary of State in New Hampshire, who's Bill Gardner. And at a convention that was held in Boston in early 2010, he introduced me to the Secretary of State in Florida. And Kurt Browning was his name, and he took me under his wing. He said, I'm not sure that what you're thinking about doing is a good idea or will work, but I will help you. And so he introduced me to 7 supervisors of elections in Florida, and I took a road trip and told them about an idea that I had to basically build an audit system which would recount the ballots of the existing voting systems, firms like Dominion, which is now a household name.
Yes.
And I was asked a really important question by a woman by the name of Susan Gill, who lives in Citrus County, Florida. And she said, if your plan is to build an audit system, which is what the idea was, that would recount the votes, the ballots that were submitted by voters, and you come up with an answer that is different than the voting system, how will you know that which system is right? And as I'm fond of saying, I had no snappy answer for that question. But it got me thinking, and about 3 months later, the idea fully formed in my head as to how to do that. And toward the end of this video, I will show the audience what we invented. So that's kind of how I got into this.
So that you saw that our voting systems were susceptible to a lot of error.
Well, it wasn't so much that, although I hoped, to be candid, that I would find that they were inaccurate. And I've given many speeches saying that was my original motivation, but I failed. So the voting systems that are certified today are extremely accurate. But if we look back, problems with elections have been with us since the founding of the country. And in the early days of the Republic, people voted not the way they do today, but they would vote on slips of paper that had different colors. They were put in boxes of the different candidates, and there was no secrecy of the ballot. There was coercion because people could tell how you voted.
Sure.
There was vote buying, and there were ballot boxes that that disappeared. And the introduction of what is called the Australian ballot solved most of those problems. It was a secret ballot. It was voted on a common stock paid for by the government, not by the political parties. And the ballots were of uniform color, and they all went into the same ballot box. So, but it was really the election of 2000 that set us off on a path that, kind of a difficult path.
Yes, that was the Bush-Gore.
That was the Bush-Gore election. And in Florida, the eventual count was something like 537 votes separating Bush from Gore.
Oh, gosh.
And
close.
And that exposed, that introduced actually the American public to a new concept of hanging chads.
Yes.
And underlying that was at least 4 types of ways to count ballots. There was a hand count. There were the punch cards that created the hanging chad. There were paper ballots that were counted by an electronic voting system. And there were several of those involved in Florida, not just one. And then there was a hand count. And so when the Supreme Court was asked how to make a uniformly, how to count ballots in a uniform way, that was impossible. And so the response to the Florida election was a bill passed by Congress and signed by President Bush called the Help America Vote Act. And while it had a number of provisions in it, the 2 most important were that it created a commission, the Election Assistance Commission, that set standards for voting systems. And now people may remember that the states control voting systems, so the feds couldn't really dictate how voting systems would operate, but what they could do is set forth the complicated technical standards for how a voting system should be built and tested and operated.
What a great step forward. So I'd like to just backtrack for a second,
Sure.
because I think there may be a lot of people who still wonder, well, the Supreme Court then, what was their thinking? Because their decision was pretty arbitrary.
Well, I think the thinking was, this is Bush v. Gore, was that what it did basically was stop the recount that was happening at
yes.
the same time. And the reasoning is that they couldn't, that the various counties and the Secretary of State could not describe a uniform method of that wouldn't violate the Equal Protection Clause
I see.
to count
I
ballots.
see. So that what you were saying is that since then, we have better methods.
Yeah, so not only did the Help America Vote Act create the Election Assistance Commission, but it also set aside just under $3 billion for counties in the United States to buy new certified voting systems. And so, and there was a lot of rocks in the road between the Help America Vote Act and where we are today.
Yeah.
One of which was Florida was using touch screens to tabulate ballots, to record the vote. And an election that happened in 2006 in Sarasota County basically recorded a huge number of undervotes, meaning that the contest was blank, for a congressional seat. And it turned out that was a flaw in the ballot design of that election. And the Democratic candidate lost by about 18,000 votes. And so Florida scrapped the entire set of touchscreen voting systems and replaced it with hand count. Well, I'm sorry, with voter-marked paper ballots, which is the standard today in nearly every county in the country.
And so we should make it clear to viewers that states run elections.
That's right.
And that's important. And that election officials, they must have a hugely complex job.
And it's gotten more complex in the last 5 years, incredibly more complex. If you think about it, as a voter, you go to the polls, you're handed a ballot, your address is checked off to make sure no one with the same address shows up, and you mark your ballot and you put it in a machine and it tabulates it right on the spot. That is the tip of an ugly iceberg.
Oh, really?
And so an election official wears many hats. They not only have to run small or large staffs. In the small counties, it may be just a few people, maybe 2 or 3. Large counties can be upwards of 200 or 300. They have to be up on every law that is passed by the legislature, and often those laws change in the same year of an election.
Laws about eligibility of voters?
Not so much eligibility, but how a ballot is constructed.
Oh, I see. The machinery.
Yeah, and so for example, in Florida in 2012, the legislature passed a bill that required the election departments to put the full text of all of the ballot initiatives instead of a 75-word summary. So in the big counties in Florida, they went from a 1-card ballot, one piece of paper, to a 7-card ballot. And many suspect that was done to create the long lines that did occur in the, I'm sorry, I said 2012, it was 2008 when Obama was coming into to winning the election. So, so they have to organize the staff, they have to mount an operation that runs primarily in one day, but cannot have a flaw. They have to take care of ballot initiatives and conduct signature verification, and then at the end they have to communicate with the public and about the steps that they take to ensure the integrity of their election.
Right.
And as we know, that got incredibly more complex in the 2020 election in the face of a pandemic.
But the investigations were able to, in most cases, question any fraud and discovered there was very little.
So what you're alluding to now is as we move from the 2020 election during COVID, that, I'm sorry, the 2016 election, which was an unexpected victory for the future president, Donald Trump, to the 2020 election, which was in the wake of a full-blown pandemic. And election departments were having to determine how to make voting safe. And that showed the rise of paper ballots and vote by mail.
So there is a constant effort to make sure that voting systems are uniform and that they're going to work, that they cannot be tampered with.
And so most states conduct, ahead of the election, they'll conduct what are called logic and accuracy tests. And that just basically, they run ballots through and with a known result in front of the public. And so the public can see that the ballots are being counted correctly. And so that's one of the safeguards. But election officials today face an exponentially greater difficulty in conducting their job. I heard last night that 30%, an astonishing number, of election officials in the country have been threatened. And so the fear of physical security has loomed as it never did before. And so that's a factor that is new to us.
Yeah, probably all of that has been, although the voting systems struggle to constantly improve, some of the skepticism might have been because of the former president's allegations.
That's right. As I think about it, the skepticism of voting, while in 2000 the skepticism was primarily were the ballots counted correctly.
Yes.
And that became really important because the 527 votes separated who became president. So, but then gradually over time, as the machines have gotten more accurate and faster, and the reported results are in quicker and quicker. In fact, some big counties can now deliver 60% of the vote count within 2 minutes after the polls close, because they're counting the absentee votes, the vote by mail, which in some states is 60% of the vote. But the game has shifted from where the ballots counted correctly to where the eligible voters were votes cast only by eligible voters. And now, unfortunately, the game has shifted even further to the people we want to vote, can we make them vote securely and safely and quickly without hassle?
Yes.
And so the world has gotten a lot more complex, and for election officials, a lot more worrisome.
But I'm thinking now that, let's go back to I want to call it a sort of epiphany that you had many years ago when you were working for Obama. I think we can say now that you were right. You were right that technology is the way that we can really make sure that voting that the results will be accurate, and also I would hope so much less labor intensive.
Right. When I started looking at how election officials were managing and running elections, it was not only a difficult thing to watch because they were laboring without any technical tools.
Yeah.
And so my background is in high tech, and so that's, as I said earlier, the challenge was to see if I could use the tools, recruit the talent, because that's not me, I don't program really well, to create a company that would come up with an innovative idea that would differentiate from the rest of the voting system companies and still be able to pay the bills, be able to attract talent and pay for it. And so that was an arduous process.
Oh, I can imagine. But you're achieving some success.
Yeah, so really the breakthrough came when this woman, Susan Gill, asked me this question: how would you determine which system is right, the audit system or the voting system? And just to recap a little bit, the audit system, auditing had typically been done by manually counting 1 or 2 precincts for 1 or 2 races. And in big counties, there can be upwards of hundreds of precincts, dozens and dozens of races on a given ballot. And so it was a time-consuming manual process that really didn't persuade anybody that indeed the elections are accurate.
Yeah.
And I sometimes called it election theater.
Yeah. Yes, I can see why.
So the challenge was to use technology to count every race across every precinct and every ballot, and to do that in and report the results within a minute after the last ballot had been processed.
And elections are becoming increasingly close, so this is very important.
We have a closely divided electorate, as everybody is, I think, aware. And so an increasing number of contests are going to recounts.
Right.
And during that time, there is a lot of disinformation that is emitted.
Right.
And so it creates anxiety for the election officials, and it furthers the notion that elections may not be as trustworthy as we would like. And so, take for example, is every voter that casts a ballot an eligible voter? Well, right now the method of determining eligibility is to write a signature on on an absentee on a ballot that's sent through the mail, and then the election department has a process by which they match the signature to the voter registration card. But as we all know, our signatures change, but even more important, young people are not being taught cursive.
Oh yes, right.
And so they write in block letters. So this is a looming problem that over time, and it's not a lot of time because tens of millions of young people are entering the age of eligibility every 4 years. And in fact, I've heard a statistic recently that between the time of the 2020 election and the 16 election and the 24 election, there'll be nearly 100 million young people that have become under the age of voting.
So
past 18.
Are then block letters less distinctive?
Yeah, they lack all the little curly cues and the little drops.
Even if it's a scrawl.
Yeah, you can still.
Yeah, I see.
You can still distinguish the two.
I see. What's going to happen?
Well, so I think if I characterize what the folks like the ACLU would like, is they would like to do away with signature, not only signature verification, but the requirement for a voter ID. And they're in favor of making it a crime to impersonate a voter, so voter fraud would be a crime. But the act of voting would be less coercive, less fraught with the opportunity to suppress the vote.
Yeah, true.
And on the other side would be a universal ID. and that you could carry around in your wallet, and that would tie yourself biometrically to the card with a fingerprint or and it couldn't be forged. The problem with that is that that becomes an opportunity for some states to make it more difficult to get that card. And that is indeed played out. So we've seen that. And so this is a conundrum that we will face increasingly over the next 2 election cycles.
So on the other hand, on one hand we have ever more ways of making voting easy with the mail-in ballot, but yet we have this voter ID, so there's, I can see the tension there.
That's right. And but to be candid, through the history of voting, there has always been this tension. And so we just have to address it, and I feel proud that the work that my company did, the Clear Ballot Group, did to produce an innovation that is now being used in, well, it counts 80% of the vote in Washington and Oregon. It is the share leader in terms of registered voters in Ohio. It's making inroads in Pennsylvania. The audit portion of that product is used statewide in Maryland and South Carolina, in most of the counties in Florida and in New York State.
There was a concern in really close elections that you couldn't really prove that the voting machines were tabulating the results correctly.
Along the way, I showed the Secretary of State, Kurt Browning, the very beginnings of this new technology.
We needed some very easy way to make that a trustworthy proposition. You could show and validate to just anyone in a very obvious manner that election results were accurate.
He said, but I need to know if this is really real.
So we began working on the automated independent audit.
As I explained what was going to happen, I was watching his eyes. And at the moment I hit the button on the laptop, and the screen appeared, and the ovals representing the intent of the electorate danced on the screen. Kurt Browning stood up. He's 6'4". He stood up and he said, I've been in elections for 26 years and I have never seen anything like this.
When you see this system, that's the jaw-dropping moment.
Today, our democracy faces a challenge not seen since the Civil War. Across America, a growing percentage of the population distrusts the outcome of elections. Threats of violence and the refusal to concede are becoming commonplace. However, throughout the history of the United States, invention, technology, and entrepreneurship have combined to address critical problems. 9 years ago, one such technology was introduced into Florida elections. It was designed to help officials organize their operations to withstand the scrutiny of a contested election and to convince reasonable people that the loser had fairly lost. This technology supports every major voting system. It has been independently tested, formally certified by state boards, and applied across thousands of contests in real elections.
It's now generally accepted that paper ballots represent the gold standard in evaluating voter intent. The problem is that paper is difficult to handle, especially when you have hundreds of thousands of sheets of paper. So digitizing this paper, like is being done in every single other industry that deals with paper, gives you an advantage of being able to pull the essential pieces of information off the digital image and convey the meaning of that to non-technical people.
How do you actually visually prove to someone in a plain, normal, very obvious manner that they've actually lost the election? As soon as you go from the numbers, it's just columns of numbers. Again, how can I trust those numbers are real? You click on one of those, and up pops all of these ovals, and that's the jaw-dropping moment when, wow, okay, I can see finally, again, that's that promise of the paper brought to reality. You can see that right there in front of you. And if you have a question about any oval, you can mouse over it and you see a clip of the race. But if you wanted, you just click on that and up pops the entire ballot, and you can see how all of the different ovals are marked. You can see that, okay, what looked like an overvote was 2 ovals filled in, but there's a big X through one of them, and down to the next to the other oval, it says, I meant to vote for this guy. And so that's a voter intent that a voting system can't see. That's just an overvote to a voting system. Or you've got a ballot that has a whole lot of blank ovals, but maybe it's an older person who can't see the ovals very well, because the ovals typically are light so that the tabulation system doesn't count an oval as a vote. But what people often do is they'll circle a name, or they'll potentially put a check mark next to an oval, next to a name, and that is not easily tabulated by a voting system either. But this vote visualization brings that right out and makes it very transparent, and you can see it right there in front of you. It's sitting there on the wall staring you in the face.
So now we have 2 completely independent systems. They don't talk to each other, but they produce comparable results. So how do we get the information to the audit system? Well, it's done in 2 ways. In Florida, they actually take the physical ballots and rescan them. There's an advantage to that because we can then detect if the operator in the primary voting system could have, for example, rescanned a set of ballots twice, or vice versa. The other way to do it is through the evaluation of ballot images that are produced by the primary voting system. And that's what's done in Maryland. And the reason that's done is because they have a very tight certification requirement. And they wanted to perform this audit over 24 counties and be able to have the audited results before they certify the election.
We take the ballots from one system, feed them through another in a very controlled manner, under camera, in publicly observable situations. As we saw in recent elections, in the 2020 elections, some states, their results were delayed for a long period of time, weeks or sometimes even over a month. Right here, when we have a close election, we can just essentially push a button and get that second set of results, that validation that compares the audit system or potentially the recount system, if it's that close, with the results from the initial tabulation. And we can do that really in real time.
In close elections, election officials have one primary responsibility: to make sure that every ballot that they receive from an eligible voter is counted exactly once. We can help these candidates visualize the differences and why they occurred, and to do that in a matter of a few minutes, understandable by literally anybody.
Well, you know, this is so encouraging that the attempts are really being made to make sure that we can trust election results.
Well,
This makes me feel very optimistic.
well, thank you. And you know, there are a lot of people that are worried about the same topic, and I think little by little we will make progress.
Yes, yes. And well, this is on National Voter Registration Day. We're ending on a positive note.
Hopefully
and,
a hopeful note.
Yeah, a hopeful note. Yes, yes. Lots of questions ahead. What's going to happen with signatures? But I trust that this having a handle on this with this kind of technology, I think we will continue to have fair elections.
I agree.
Good. Thank you so much for being here.
And thank you, Barbara.
for looking at the opening up the trunk and letting us see this intricate machinery for something terribly important. And we should end on this note. Everyone should register to vote. It's just so important.
And then vote.
And then register and then vote, exactly. Right. Thank you very much, viewers, for watching. And Larry, thank you very much for being here to talk to us about voting.
Beyond my pleasure.
Yes.
How long was that?
was about 40 minutes. 40.